Hey, I think that it is 10 o'clock, so we are going to get started with the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are very excited to have to be hosting the second in our webinar series about farm to early care. So we're doing 4 webinars. This is the second one in a row that we've done, and the first one was great. I'm glad that you're joining us for this one. Our goal with these webinars is to try to distill the training that we at IATP have been doing around our farm to early care model and share with those of you who might want to do your own farm to early care programs in your own settings. Basically, we're taking the training that we normally do and simplifying it and sharing it out with all of you. So my name is Erin McKee. I am the Farm to Institution Program Director here at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And today, this is the second of our webinar series. We are focusing on CACFP compliance and on-farm food safety assessment. And these are 2 things that all of our partners, when we're working with new partners who are trying to get programs started, they ask us about these things. How can I make sure that I'm following the rules that I need to for CACFP, the meal program, that I'm following the meal pattern correctly? And how do I know that the local food that I'm purchasing from farmers in my community is safe to serve to the kids in my program? Obviously, these are huge, important questions to all of you who are trying to really do things the right way, and you want to source locally, but you want to make sure that it's okay and that you're doing what you're supposed to do. So that's what we're going to be addressing today. We are very lucky to have 2 very impressive speakers with us today. The first thing we're going to hear about is the on-farm food safety assessment, and we're going to hear from Annalisa Hultberg, and then we're going to transition. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A with Annalisa. She can't stay for the whole time because she has to get out and back on her job, but we'll have Q&A right after she's done talking about on-farm food safety, and then we'll pass it over to Molly Butala from MDE, and she's going to talk about the CACFP meal program and how to do farm to early care with that meal program. So we are very excited. Thanks for joining us. And Katie's going to tell us a little bit more about the webinar and what you need to know for the webinar.
Good morning, everybody. This is Katie Costello. I'm the Farm to Institution Program Associate here at IATP. And as Erin said, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. I'm going to try and advance the slide. There we go. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the Zoom webinar taskbar at either at the bottom of or the top of your screen. If you have a question for our panelists throughout the presentation, we encourage you to use the Q&A chat function. If you have like a technical issue or something is going on with your audio, please use the chat function to let us know. Oops, I apologize. We'll get to as many questions as we have time for, but I encourage you to, at any time, if you think of anything, use that Q&A function to submit your question. We'll also have a short evaluation available after the webinar. I will put a link to that evaluation in the chat function, and so stay tuned for that. We would really appreciate your feedback. As Erin said, this is only our second webinar, so any suggestions that you have for how to make these more relevant or useful would be really, really helpful. And for those of you who need a certificate of attendance or proof of attendance, you can email me. I'll have my information up at the end of the webinar. Just email me and I can get that certificate to you. Finally, this webinar is recorded and we'll have it up, an archived version on our website. So stay tuned for a follow-up email with that recording, as well as some of the links that our panelists will discuss. Hopefully I'll get that out later today. So let's get started. First, we're going to hear from Annalisa Hultberg from the University of Minnesota Extension.
Okay, I'm going to, pull up the chat because I was told to do that. Okay. Annalisa Hultberg, University of Minnesota Extension. I'm an extension educator, so extension brings the science and research of the university out into the community. I work with farmers on-farm food safety and good agricultural practices, and I work with folks like you who want to buy from those farmers. So thanks to IATP for hosting this important webinar today, and thank you all for being here today as well. My objectives today in this very short overview is to help you really understand basic farm food safety practices so that you can have a conversation with farmers. This isn't intended to make you experts in this field. You have enough on your plate, but really just to make you more comfortable and to increase your confidence and reduce any fears, if you do have any fears about the safety of locally grown foods, and empower you to have those important conversations with the growers. I also hope that you are able to better understand the ways that you can get locally grown food into your food service establishments, and then know where to find additional resources, because I am only going to be here for about 20 minutes, and this is a roughly 7-hour workshop condensed into 20 minutes, so it's pretty high level. I do want to point you to a resource that we created a few years back with the Department of Health, and it's a conversation guide. So if you forget everything you heard today, I hope you won't, but it really is kind of the main topic. So some of those questions that you should ask farmers, that I suggest that you ask farmers if you're buying directly from them, are bulleted here on this short resource. And then of course I am available to you as well. You can email me. My email and this conversation guide will be sent in a link by Katie afterwards. So just to be very clear, that a grower is an approved source for your food service establishment. So the Department of Health, the Department of Ag, and Extension put out these fact sheets a few years, or actually this one was just reissued, and it really documents the fact that it's absolutely okay, it's legal for you to use this produce that was grown by a farmer. So they don't have to have any sort of license, they don't have to have any sort of approval, just to be clear on that. So good agricultural practices are what I'm going to tell you about today. And really they are HACCP for farms is a way to think about it. So it's the ways that farmers reduce the chances that contaminants, microbes will be on the produce that they handle and sell to you. They are voluntary, they're not a law. This isn't any sort of a regulation. It truly is just science-based, evidence-based best practices that farmers take. So I provide the education to growers on these practices, and then they take them or not, but it's up to them. So how we work with growers is we do workshops for them. I review their food safety plans. I answer questions via emails, via phone. So if you are in communication with growers and these kind of questions come up where farmers say, well, how do I get my water tested on farm? Or can you tell me how to build a hand washing stand? You can answer those questions, but please pass them on to me if it seems, that you aren't able to answer the question. And I just want to be clear that growers really are generally really positive about farm food safety. They really take this really seriously because they want to provide, they got into farming to provide healthy food for their community. So they aren't negligent. They really aren't, it's a very good way to buy food for your establishment. And in general, there's a lot of record keeping with food safety, and these records are useful for many purposes. So a lot of them really see improved efficiency across the farm when they start documenting some of these things. But it is the reason that I suggest that you have these conversations with these growers is that, as you know, you'll be serving this to children. Children, by their definition, are immunocompromised. Their immune systems are not fully functioning yet. And so if they were to get sick from a foodborne illness, it could be pretty bad. So, and it's also bad for the farmer. So we really encourage farmers to take these kind of common sense practices to make sure that we don't have any sort of an outbreak. And I do want to be clear that the produce, you can buy produce from a distributor or you can buy produce from a farmer, are generally the two kind of channels for you, and one is not more or less safe than the other. It's just that you need to have that conversation with the grower when you're buying it directly, but from a distributor, they have the conversation with the farmer. Really, that's the only difference. So a gap audit is not scary. It can be new to a farmer. So if you require it of a farmer, they they might find that cost prohibitive and be a little bit scary. But just to be clear what it is, I do not do the audit. I am an educator. A regulator at the Department of Agriculture would be the one that did that audit. So really all it is the farmer paying a Department of Agriculture employee who's given authority by the United States Department of Agriculture to come out and look at their practices, to look at the things that I suggest that you talk to them about. And they farmers have to pay for this audit, and it's generally about $500. It can be significantly more. And there's only a handful, about 25 diverse vegetable operations in the farm that have a gap, in the state that have a gap audit. So I would suggest that you not start out by requiring a gap audit. You may, it's your prerogative, but it's really going to limit the number of growers that you can buy from. So I would suggest that you have this conversation with them, you ask to see a food safety plan, visit the farm if possible, and then encourage them to have this food safety plan. If they want to get an audit one day, then they'll be able to get that audit really quickly, because the food safety plan is kind of the basis of the audit. So you're actually kind of helping them along, and they can get that audit eventually if they need to for a wholesale. So a wholesale buyer like a Bix or a Cisco requires that gap audit. But most growers do not sell into those wholesale places, therefore don't have the audit. I do think there are so many benefits from buying directly from a farm, so I really hope that you consider buying directly from a farm if you haven't in the past. There are questions, of course, that you should ask, a conversation that you have about price, when they can deliver, how they can deliver, and along with that, I hope that you have a conversation about their on-farm food safety practices in a conversational tone. It doesn't need to be an interrogation. These are the main concepts that constitute GAPs, good agricultural practices. So there's kind of 5 main topics: the workers, water on the farm, soil and manure, animals on the farm, post-harvest handling, and then records. It's a little less important because a record is just a documentation of what they actually did. So those are the kind of concepts. I'll give you a brief overview here in a minute. But I did want to point out, so if you see at the screen, there are the 5, besides sprouts, which you're probably not buying, the 5 kind of next highest risk items are leafy greens, melons, tomatoes, fresh berries, and herbs. So this is a way to kind of prioritize food safety. So if you were brand new to buying from a local producer, you probably would not want to buy a leafy green. Leafy green are the most commonly implicated in a foodborne outbreak, and that's just because of their crinkly leaf surface. They're grown on the ground. They're just kind of a higher risk product. I would suggest something, a carrot, a potato, even a zucchini, cucumbers, those kind of things to start out with. Once you have a relationship with the farmer and you feel really comfortable with them, by all means, maybe move into some of these other products, but it's just a way to kind of start out. So some of the main topics now that I suggest that you have this conversation with, and again, this is all in that resource guide, but ask about their worker training. So farms have policies on their farm about their employees, because employees are generally the ones transmitting germs around the farm. It's our hands that are dirty. So the farm needs to provide training to that employee. So just like in a food service establishment, just like in a restaurant, that person is a food handler, the employee, the person picking that lettuce. So I would ask them, what do you do for employee training? Do you encourage them to teach your employees, for example, you never work when you're sick? This is kind of just a basic rule. Hand washing, look for hand washing stands or ask about them. This is a model that we made. It's really low cost. It's about $20, and the bulk of that, $10, is that blue water tank on top. It's a continuous flow valve, so the water flows down. There's a hand wash. There's a bucket to catch the water that they can just throw on some grass or trees when they're done, and there's a covered garbage can there, and then that little thing in there holds the paper towels. So they do need to use the single-use paper towel, just like in a in a restaurant, and then there's soap there too. So I would really encourage you to ask about this. This is the best thing farms can do for food safety. It's kind of the #1 priority. I like to see these out near the field. The farmhouse is great. Oh, we use my sink. Well, that's okay, but do you really have paper towels in at your sink? No, you probably don't. So, and then also depending, it could be kind of a far walk from the field into the house. So having this mobile hand wash stand is really a great way to ensure that farms are really having good hygiene. So there's other ways to to have hand wash stands. We've seen all kinds of configurations, just a plain igloo. That's okay. You have to press that little valve on the top, so I don't like that one as much, but they do not have to be fancy by any means, but they should have these things on them. So that's kind of number one. There should be a toilet for the employees to use. We never ever use the side of the field. I don't see that, just to be clear. I've never seen that, but there should be a place for them to use the bathroom, and if it's nice if they have a porta potty if the house is far away. Water needs to be potable. So if it's municipal water, if it's city water by chance, then that's already tested. You don't have to worry about that. If it is well water, they need to be testing it annually for just a general potability test through a certified lab. And the Department of Health has a list of certified labs. We also have fact sheets on this on our website. But generally, you're testing for bacteria, total coliform bacteria, E. coli, because that's the specific bacteria that we're worried about, and then nitrites and nitrates. Just give a general water quality assessment there. Surface water would be a pond or a lake. We really do not encourage farmers to use that if possible. If they're using that for irrigation of produce early on, say before the produce is fruited, if it's a fruiting produce, that would be slightly acceptable. It's still a pretty high risk practice, so ask, are you using any kind of surface water? And they would never use surface water for any kind of post-harvest application like washing the actual vegetables. The only way they could use surface water would be in irrigation. But I actually don't see that very often in our state. This is why surface water is dangerous. In other states, they have their groundwater. They don't have as much groundwater, so they use a lot more surface water. California, this is huge. People are figuring out how to use surface water. We don't have to do that here yet. But yeah. Lots of animals in surface water, lots of ducks. So, soil amendments. Manure is a good source of fertility for vegetables. We are not banning the use of manure by any means. It just means that if you're using animal-based compost, that you're doing it safely. So I would recommend that you ask, do you use animal-based compost? If they say, no, I've never used it, I just use a fertilizer or something. Nope, no problem. On to the next question. If they use an animal-based manure, say, do you apply it in the fall? That's really the best practice. 120 days between when that manure is worked into the soil and when they harvest the vegetable is the best practice right now. Most farms actually are not using manure. A lot of them just use a fertilizer. If they are using a manure, you just make sure they're doing it correctly. And then sometimes if they're doing it, if they purchase from an off-farm place, that's fine. There's no waiting period. It's been fully treated, and there is a certificate of analysis that comes with it. Animals are not a problem in the way that we think of them. So sometimes animals, people say, oh, we can't have any animals on the farm, no dogs allowed. It's absolutely not true. What you need to do is do your best to keep them out of the growing area. So a kitty in the harvest tote there, not good. This is not something I'd want to see. A deer, it eats the vegetables and it can poop, so not good. We do our best to keep it out. Dogs and cats in the growing area, not something we want to see. They carry pathogens of concern, and we just want to do our best to keep them out. But again, they don't have to fully exclude them because you frankly can't. There will be deers walking through. Just do your best. Farmers get very creative to keep deers out because they don't like deer in their eating their lettuce any more than we do. Tall fences, there's DNR programs that farmers can use to get fences. There's a long wait list for them. It can be kind of a challenge. Fencing is expensive and can be difficult. But again, we just ask that they do their best. You can have a farm dog, just keep it out of the growing areas. And really, we ask them before you harvest, are they kind of looking out just to make sure, is there signs of a lot of animals in the growing area? Do you see signs of poop or, bedded down grass where there might have been a large number of animals, and just keep on top of that. Finally, post-harvest handling and pack shed sanitation. So often farms generally they will have a pack shed or a packing area on the farm where they bring the produce back to wash and pack and store. So it does not need to be fancy. It can be, the ideal is that it has a cement floor and a sealed 4 walls and a roof. it doesn't always work out that way because that's pretty expensive. So sometimes it's just a shade tent and there's mowed grass and they've got tables there and they're packing there. That's completely fine. That's acceptable. It just needs to be tidy, and like in any food service establishment, things are up off the ground. So if you're in a pack shed like this, it's up off the ground. If you're on just a mowed area, you're also, stuff is up off the ground there as well. And this is great. This is what we like to see. A lot of these totes are color coded. I don't know what the color codes are, but I guarantee that the yellow and the green and the black all mean something. They've been washed and cleaned and they're drying upside down. So that's what we like to see. In any pack shed, you need to remove the stuff so that birds and rodents aren't attracted to it. So this bottom picture here that has the kind of clutter around it, we really just recommend getting rid of all that clutter and keeping it mowed down, because that's going to decrease the chances that there's going to be rodents and other animals drawn to it. Knock down birds' nests whenever you see them, because birds, we don't want birds in our pack shed and they poop all over. If there are mouse, we encourage mouse traps, but you can't use a bait. They just make these tin cat versions, which is just like a little thing that you put up against the wall. You'll see them in warehouses as well, and the mice just run in them. But they don't. You wouldn't use like just a snap trap with peanut butter or anything like that. So these are the kind of totes that a farmer is going to pick their vegetables into, and this is the kind of tools and equipment, and we encourage them to be cleaning and sanitizing them regularly. So the farmers will determine that schedule. There is no set schedule. It really just keep it clean, and knowing that this is a farm, not a food service establishment, so it's going to be a lot more dirty. There's going to be field dirt on it, and that's okay, but hosing it down at the end of the day and then sanitizing it throughout the season just with a chlorine bleach, or there's other like peracetic acid based sanitizers that they just spray on there a couple of times a season is sufficient. A lot of growers are going to be sanitizing their tools, like their harvest knives on a daily basis, because of like fungal and other kind of plant health disease issues as well. So for the actual washing of vegetables, in general, not all vegetables should be washed, and in food safety it's sometimes a little bit counterintuitive, but washing the vegetables can introduce pathogens that weren't there before. So water is a great conduit for all those pathogens. So anytime anything is in a big bulk container like that, if there was, say, some bird poop on one zucchini, now it's kind of on all the zucchinis. So we really encourage, unless it really needs it to be either washed or hydrocooled, don't wash it. And that's the conversation that you would have with the farmer. You'd say, you know, these zucchinis are coming in pretty clean. It wasn't raining, so they're not sprayed. You know, they don't have a bunch of mud caked on them. You don't need to wash them. And they'll say, great. You know, the less working, the better for them. This is a spray, so that's a bulk tank. A leafy green has to be washed in that bulk tank scenario, and that's okay. But you'll see that this is a 3-bin system, just like you would have a 3-compartment sink in your kitchen. So the first one gets the bulk of the field dirt off, and this 3-bin system can be used with any vegetable. The second one sometimes contains a sanitizer in the wash water. It doesn't have to. And then the third one is the cleanest, so the produce comes out pretty clean. And that's a spray table. So that's a great way to really wash the produce safely as well, because then the produce is just going down. It's that shower versus, you know, bath. So I would just to be clear, I would just ask them about, so are you washing the vegetables? If so, have you had the water tested, your well water tested? And just tell me about how you're washing them. How do you wash and clean the actual containers that you'll be using pretty quickly? Sorry, okay, records. So just ask about records. Say, you know, do you keep any kind of records on your farm? They probably do not have a full farm food safety plan, because frankly, if it's not required, they just don't do it. It doesn't mean that it's bad if they don't have one. It just means that their practices might be great, but they haven't gotten around to documenting it. But I would encourage you to encourage them. Say, you know, can you just document your basic cleaning and sanitizing routine? Just have a little check mark, real simple. You don't have to fully write it out. Just have this hanging in the pack shed, and then when you clean at the end of the night, just say what just mark it off. And then this actually really helps them, because then as the farm manager, I don't have an employee saying, wait, what do we do again for cleaning and sanitizing? It's all documented right there. And so once they've established these systems, they actually find them really helpful and time saving. So this is different kind of records here. I would really just ask you to ask about the Farm Food Safety Plan. And again, I can review that if they do have one. And we have a template on our website. It's a Word doc that they can download, so they're not starting from scratch. So the main take-home message is, locally grown food is a great way to encourage your kids to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. I've worked at a farm to school position for years in a K through 12 setting, and it really is great. Your kids love it. It's great for our local economy, and the food is not necessarily more safe or less safe. It's just a matter of having that conversation with the growers and feeling comfortable with kind of the basics. We do have resources to help. This is a snap of our website here, and that will be sent out. And then we also have a how to build a hand washing stand, for example, so they don't have to figure out how to make that. And it has all the specs. U of M Extension has the Farm to School page. Of course, IETP is a great resource for you. And then I also put this in, and Kate will be sending that. But that's just it's a school garden safety guide, but it's the same concepts, and especially if you start a school garden as well, which you might, I would encourage you to look at that. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Annalisa. That was so helpful. I feel like you are addressing questions that we hear every time we work with new partners, every time we present on these things. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what is allowed and whether it's okay to purchase from local farms. And then if people do know it's okay, they don't know, how to assess whether a new farmer partner is going to be the right one that they can buy from. So that was very helpful information. So I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions for Annalisa, we're going to take a little time right now to do questions with her, and you can type them into that Q&A function on your Zoom platform. One thing I did want to send out as people are typing in their questions, or just mention and highlight from your presentation, Annalisa, was the resource that you talked about at the beginning about the fact sheet that was talking about, like, yes, it is allowed to purchase from local farmers. I've heard a lot of people who are maybe the food service director position for their school or their early care environment. They are interested in purchasing locally, but they need to make the case to, like, the principal or maybe the board for their school or something like that. And I feel like those resources are really helpful in outlining the basic rules, so that, because a lot of times, even if they know that it's okay, they need to be able to convince the other people around them that it's okay. So yep. I think those are really helpful resources for
Absolutely.
them.
And those have been exhaustively researched. I mean, they took like a year putting those together. So they are absolutely, of the moment right now, current, updated. It very clearly, I think they're each 2 pages, front and back, so pretty short, but they clearly lay out that is legal. So I would say that the fact sheet in combination with the conversation that you would have with the grower would be kind of what you would bring, because I can imagine maybe there's a principal or even a parent, a concerned parent. If they came to you and said, oh, it's great that you're buying this local produce, do you know anything about where it came from? Did you ask questions? If you say no, I mean, maybe that's okay, but wouldn't it be better to be able to say, yeah, yep, I visited the farm, I had a conversation with them, they're using the best practices, and it's, I think we're really good to go. Then it just, you're just showing that you've done your diligence.
I also liked what you were talking about as far as whether to require an audit. And I was thinking especially about something that we care a lot about with our programs from IATP's standpoint is trying to help new farmers enter the market if they want to be selling to institutions. And sometimes there is a barrier of cost for those formal certifications, especially for smaller farmers, otherwise disadvantaged farmers, you know, immigrant farmers, beginning
it's the
farmers.
cost of the audit, but actually I would say it's more because there's a cost share program through the Department of Agriculture. So 75% of the cost of the audit can actually be reimbursed to the farmer. So the actual audit itself, it can, if you can do all that paperwork and stuff, which is not true for everybody, especially limited English, it ends up, you know, maybe not being so much money. It's much more the time and the knowledge about how to prepare for it, frankly, the record keeping. So if you picture most farms doing 90% of these things that I'm talking about already, they really are doing it. They just don't document it. And the audit is on the documentation and on their practices. So if the auditor comes out and doesn't have a food safety plan, they won't even start the audit. So it's and that actual creating a full food safety plan can take, I mean, generally people say it takes like 10 to 15 hours over the course of like a year, but it's those log sheets that farmers do really need to fill out. That's it. It's just it's time consuming. So it's that in addition to the some hundreds of dollars to the audit. But I would say I'm seeing it's much more the kind of the knowledge and the time of those records that can be pretty prohibitive. So yes, I would really, if you can get away with it, really just say, you know, we don't require that audit. We have a conversation with our growers. That's what Minneapolis Public Schools is doing. That's what a lot of big places are doing. They're not requiring that audit.
So when you're working with farmers, who are you actually working with?
Generally the farm manager. Or do you mean which size of farms?
Yeah, like how did the farmers end up connecting with you to get your training?
So because I'm in extension, we have local educators at the county and the region level throughout the state. So they know of me, and then the farms call into the farm information line. It's call and have a question, and then they send them on to me. Or we put out a announcement that we're having a workshop, and then they hear about it and sign up. And sometimes, frankly, they really do come a bit from a place of fear. They wonder, ooh, is this going to be some difficult thing? And they kind of come in a little bit negative sometimes, but by the end they say, oh my gosh, this is what we're already doing. It's not that hard. It's common sense, and it's helping me create safer produce safer produce, which is what they want to do, like in their hearts. They really are passionate about selling safe produce. So they always come around and are very positive and kind of thankful.
So if a farmer were watching this webinar and was like, oh, I could really use that support, or if a food service person who's watching this webinar has a farmer in mind, would they be able to refer them to you to get to look for when the next training is coming up? In Minnesota, we're talking about Minnesota. I know we have people on the line who are not in Minnesota, so sorry.
In other states, I have a colleague in many. I'm a part of a couple of different regional networks of colleagues in other states that do this in our surrounding states. We don't actually do that many of the full day workshops. There's just not that many. We don't have a huge produce industry here, frankly. And so I'd say over the course of the year, we generally do 5 to 6 workshops, so a handful, and we try to do them throughout the state. More, if it was the first time that I'd connected with the grower, it would be a conversation on a phone call, and then it would be a review of the food safety plan, generally by email. If I'm in the region, I can't generally go out specifically to one farm, drive 2 hours to do a walkthrough with one farm. If I was in the region and I could make it happen mileage-wise, I could definitely swing by there. And then also know that in your regions, if there's enough interest, like I work pretty closely with the regional sustainable development partnerships with SFA. If there is a group of growers that come together and say, we have 10, 15 growers and we'd love for you to put on a workshop, then I'll make it happen. It's more like getting the growers together that sometimes can be the challenge. And I do them in the summer and I do them in the winter. Summer on farm, winter in the classroom.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Annalisa. That was very helpful. And I know you have to run, but we really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with everyone.
No problem. And I really appreciate you putting this on, and really feel free to reach out to me. And if I'll do my best to answer any question as well.
And attendees, we will have Annalisa's contact information in our follow-up email, as well as the links to the resources that she mentioned. So thank you again, Annalisa.
Sure.
And now we are going to be passing it off to Molly from the Department of Education, and she will be talking about the CACFP program and how that works together with Farm to Early Care. So Molly, I will pass it off to you.
All right, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, well, as Erin said, my name is Molly Butala. I'm with Minnesota Department of Education. I'm a child nutrition specialist with the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP, and Summer Food Service Program. So let's just jump right in here. Let's see how I advance my slides. Here we go. All right, so what is the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP? It is a United States Department of Agriculture, USDA child nutrition program, much like the National School Lunch Program. And the purpose is really to provide aid to child and adult care institutions and family daycare homes for the provision of nutritious foods that contribute to wellness, healthy growth, and development of young children. And this is straight out of USDA's mouth. So this is their official purpose for the program. There actually wasn't a written purpose for a long time, and now there is. So we're happy about that. When I say child care institutions, I mean any early care or education setting. So that could be Head Start, a preschool, child care center, home. And also when I say reimbursement, it provides aid in the form of reimbursement money. I don't mean dollar for dollar reimbursement of costs for offering meals and snacks. It's more like a supplement to your food budget to help offset the cost of providing healthy meals and snacks. So it's reimbursement in that you get the money after you serve the meals. And the program is currently undergoing some big changes. We're getting ready for a new meal pattern. And a meal pattern is the standard that all meals and snacks must meet in order to get money through CACFP. So that new meal pattern becomes effective October 1st, 2017. And it is the biggest update to the program since 1968 when the program began. So also, I just want to note that in Minnesota, at least, Minnesota Department of Human Services, or DHS, child care licensing requires that all licensed child care centers and homes in Minnesota follow the CACFP meal pattern. So they're kind of looking out for that too. It's in the state laws for licensing that they follow our meal patterns. They don't have to follow all of the rules, but the meal pattern at least. So,
Molly, is that even if they're not enrolled in the program, they have to follow the pattern? Is that right?
Correct. So if you are licensed as a child care center or home in Minnesota, you have to serve meals and snacks according to the CACFP meal pattern. And I will actually show you what those meal patterns are in just a few minutes. But yeah, you don't have to follow some of the rules that I'm going to go over, like procurement rules. So I just want to say that throughout this webinar, I'll be referring to you as CACFP sponsors. So that just means anyone participating in the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or if you're interested in participating. That's what I'm referring to. All right. So for those of you who are familiar with CACFP or have heard of it, you're probably wondering, well, how does Farm to Early Care really fit in with CACFP rules? Well, it turns out they fit together pretty well. CACFP provides daily opportunities to serve local foods. In fact, USDA encourages CACFP sponsors to use local foods as a means of enhancing CACFP operations and improving the overall quality of meals and snacks. And USDA released an official policy memo in 2015 that I have here on the slide about how to use local foods in CACFP. And policy memos from USDA are just as important as federal program regulations. So the fact that USDA there is a USDA memo that exists on this topic means that USDA actually cares a great deal about procuring local foods for CACFP. So hopefully throughout the next 10 minutes, I can help you make more sense of what this really means in terms of how to use local foods in CACFP meals and snacks. And yes, as Annalisa said, farms are a perfectly acceptable source of food for USDA programs, just like a grocery store or distributor or something like that. They are an approved place to buy food for your meals and snacks. So first of all, local foods can be incorporated into any of the required food components at any meal or snack. So this is a required meal pattern for lunch and supper meals in CACFP. For many programs, fresh fruits and vegetables are a logistical starting place for incorporating local foods. Fresh fruits are especially easy because they can be served with little to no preparation beyond washing. However, local ingredients can be incorporated into all of the required food components for CACFP meals and snacks. You can find grain products with locally sourced grains, local meats, eggs, and cheeses to fulfill the meat alternate component. And it's fairly easy to find local milk, which is required for all CACFP lunches, suppers, and breakfasts. So this is the lunch and supper meal pattern. When I say food component, I just mean one of these 5 food categories. And then here's the meal pattern for breakfast and snack. So breakfast, there's 3 required food components: a fruit or vegetable, grain, and milk. For example, in late June or July, you might serve farm fresh strawberries with whole grain pancakes and milk for breakfast. And the snack meal pattern is really flexible. You can simply choose any 2 of the 5 food components. And snack is a perfect place you could start incorporating local foods. And now with the changes to the meal pattern that I mentioned at the beginning, you can serve a fruit and a vegetable as the 2 components. So prior to this, fruit and vegetables were combined as 1 food component, so you could only serve a fruit or a vegetable and one other thing at snack. But now if you wanted to do fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, say, at snack as just the 2 food items to serve, you could do that. All right, so then there's also, USDA has published a set of best practice recommendations with the new meal pattern. So these are things that USDA encourages all CACFP sponsors to try incorporating into their program, but they're not required in order to receive reimbursement money. This is kind of like, let's go above and beyond. So as you can see, the very first one is incorporate seasonal and locally produced foods into meals. So like I said, this is written into the official regulations for this program, so it's kind of a big deal that this is in there. They really do encourage this. And USDA understands that incorporating local food into CACFP can play an important role in creating healthy environment. So it is seen as a strategy to better meet CACFP standards and improve the overall quality of the program. Number 2, make at least one of the 2 required food components at snack a vegetable or a fruit. So this best practice emphasizes increasing the number of eating experiences in a day when a child is exposed to fruits and vegetables. And obviously local food purchasing provides access to fresh and more varied fruits and vegetables. Number 3, serve a variety of fruits and choose whole fruit. Oh my goodness, the phone's ringing, hang on. Sorry about that, it's not my office. Okay, so number 3, serve a variety of fruits and choose whole fruits more often than juice. Again, you can easily meet this best practice recommendation with locally sourced fruits. 4, purchasing local food can increase access to a wider variety of vegetables of different colors. I'm gonna leave this off the hook, I'm sorry. So early care program staff can work directly with growers to plant varieties of colors of common produce, such as purple cauliflower, yellow carrots, a variety of leafy greens, to meet this best practice recommendation. And the last 2 recommendations are geared towards the meat alternate food component. So there's an emphasis on serving only lean meats, nuts, and legumes. That can easily be done with some local products that are often, pasture-raised meats. And then lastly, I'm gonna unplug her phone. Limit serving processed meats to no more than 1 serving per week. And overall, we would like to see less processed meat served in CACFP. So this is a great place where locally sourced meats could be a great option. All right, so here's an example of several ways you can incorporate local foods into a menu that also meets the CACFP meal pattern. So here's a really typical one-day menu at a child care center under current menu. And perhaps instead of canned peaches, like right now, June 20th, you could find some nice fresh farm fresh strawberries to serve instead of those canned peaches. And then milk you can get locally, all year round. So you could use that at breakfast and lunch. And then for lunch, if you're already planning chicken quesadillas, you could try sourcing some local chicken for those and try fresh green beans instead of canned green beans. And then for snack, maybe since apples are not in season, you could try broccoli this time of year or source some local cheese for that cheese. So hopefully this helps illustrate how simple it could be to incorporate local ingredients into your meals and snacks without completely overhauling your menus. And I wouldn't expect you to make all of these changes in one day, but maybe over the course of a week or a month, you could see how these foods could fit in. All right, so now that you have an idea of how to fit these foods into your CACFP menus, let's talk a little bit about the rules around purchasing local foods. So Annalisa talked a lot about food safety on the farm, and we're going to talk specifically about the rules around procuring food in the Child and Adult Care Food Program, and all USDA child nutrition programs follow the same rules. So procurement, when I say that, I mean this is the method by which you get your food. And food service supplies and food-related services, so like a vended meal provider, a caterer. And funds generally in CACFP need to be used appropriately. These are taxpayer dollars, so USDA wants to make sure that they are used fairly with a focus on open and fair competition. And there are 3 methods for procurement that you can choose depending on what you want to get and how you want to go about it. So micro purchase method, which is the newest method available, informal purchase method, and formal procurement. And I will go through each of these one by one here to give you a little brief overview of them. So micro purchase method, that is to be used if your transaction is less than $3,500. A single transaction means a single purchase for an item or items, like one trip to the store, or one contractor agreement with a vendor or a caterer. Program staff are not allowed to artificially divide purchases in order to make them fall under that smaller $3,500 threshold. The benefit of this method is that you don't need price comparisons. So the only documentation needed is receipts, which are required for all CACFP related expenses anyway. And the micro purchase method is really ideal for non-routine purchases like a special event, or for more seasonal purchases, and multiple purchases of the same product must be spread among qualified vendors. So that's kind of the downfall of micro purchase. So if you want to buy the same thing or multiple things from the same place all the time, the micro purchasing really isn't right for you. So I'll just give you a couple examples here of micro purchasing. So let's say you're planning a Great Lakes Great Apple Crunch Day. It's a one-day event coming up here on October 12th, 2017, shameless plug, celebrating Minnesota apples and Farm to Early Care Month in October. CACFP sponsors can use the micro purchase method for those local apples if the total cost is less than $3,500, because the Apple Crunch is a one-time event and not typically included in the program's planned food purchases. So hopefully that makes sense. And then another example is Happy-Go-Lucky Childcare purchases occasional small quantities of cantaloupe, watermelon, and other fruits from various local farm stands based on seasonal availability. Because the center's purchases are under $3,500 at each transaction, they're able to use the micro purchase method. I just wanted to point out the underlined words here, various local farm stands. So they're going around to different farm stands and buying produce rather than buying the same from the same farm stand each time. And again, they need receipts for those purchases, and they can be handwritten, that's fine. All right. Let's go to informal procurement method really quick here. So this is the second most common method of procurement that most sponsors of CACFP use. And this method is to be used when you make routine purchases from the same vendor and the total spent on the purchases from the same vendor is less than $150,000 per year. So if you spend more than that in a year from any one store or vendor, then you would be bumped up to the next category up, which I'll just briefly mention in a bit. So for informal procurement method, the first step is to write specifications for the items that you want to buy. So specifications are criteria that the vendor must meet in order to be considered as a vendor that you will purchase from. And most of your products will have very broad specifications. For instance, let's say you want to buy fresh apples once a week. Your specification might just be apples in whatever variety that you think you want to buy and how much you want to buy weekly. Those would be your specs. And when we're talking about buying local foods, you can't use the word local as a specification, but you can state it as a preference. And you can also write your specifications in a way that target local products without using the word local. So for example, the vendor is able to deliver products. The vendor can supply all the produce needed in the variety and quantity that you want them or need them in. The vendor can provide the location of origin for their products. So ask that the vendor tells you where their produce came from. Another spec could be the vendor is available for farm tours. And lastly, you can specify that the produce must be harvested within 48 hours of delivery. These are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list of specifications you could use to target local products. So for most sponsors, many of these criteria are more specific than your criteria you'd usually use, but it'd be helpful in zeroing in on those products. All right, so I have, oops, I forgot to change slides. All right. And then, sorry, find my notes here. So after you decide what you want to buy and written your specifications, the second step is to obtain and document price quotes from 3 different vendors. So this is the written price comparisons that most sponsors use, and it must include the date, names of vendors compared, products compared, and the quotes from the vendors. The quotes can be taken verbally in person or over the phone, but must be written down. And you can compare and select a vendor based on a list of items or item by item. For example, let's say that most of the products from Joe's farm are less expensive than Sally's farm, but Sally's apples are less expensive than Joe's farm. You can buy just apples from Sally's farm and the rest of your local produce from Joe's farm. So also one nice thing about informal procurement is that you choose which vendors to contact. So you don't need to compare every last vendor that might be able to meet your specifications. You get to choose the vendors that you compare, and you can limit the number of vendors to just those that you already know offer local products if you want. The last step is to compare offers, choose the lowest price that meets your specifications, and document which vendor was selected. So here's a quick example of a documentation sheet that you could use. You can come up with whatever you want to compare those things that you want to compare for your specifications, price, etc. And this one's taken from this lovely new resource, Local Food for Little Eaters, a purchasing toolbox for child and adult care food program from Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. And I have the URL there. So thank you for anyone who has helped with this resource is on the line. This is an awesome resource, and I think Katie is going to be including it in a follow-up email to you guys. So that's just an example of how you could document informal procurement. And an example, so center orders local fruits and vegetables from a regional food hub. The center documents prices for 5 frequently purchased products and obtains quotes from 3 vendors of its choice, including the food hub. The center also considers the following. So the first two bullets are specifications, perhaps, the vendor's distance from the center and availability to deliver, and then the ability to source all of its needed produce from that vendor. And they have a stated priority to support small and minority-owned businesses whenever possible. And quickly, formal procurement. So this is for people who buy at least $150,000 or over $150,000 worth of product or services from one vendor. You can always choose to do formal if you want to, but it is required if you are over that $150,000 threshold in CACFP. So it involves putting together a formal bid, which can be a request for proposal or invitation for bid. I'm not going to go through what those are, the differences. You can follow up with me later if you have more questions about formal procurement. All right, and we talked a little bit about required documentation. So receipts are always required. Here's what you need on receipts: date of purchase, vendor name, items purchased, item cost, total cost of transaction. If you get donated produce, keep some sort of documentation of that has at least the date, what it was, who it was from. And then informal procurement, you would need that price comparison sheet, something like what I showed you on a few slides ago, and also receipts. And then for formal, you do need all those bid documents and receipts for all your purchases for that too. So the common theme here is receipts are required. All right, and the last thing I just wanted to point out to you guys, that garden supplies are an allowable expense in CACFP. What that means is that you can use your reimbursement money to pay for things like seeds, fertilizer, watering cans, rakes, labor, plot rental, etc. As long as the garden produce is being used as part of a reimbursable meal or snack or nutrition education activities. I just want to note also that there's no extra reimbursement money for gardening. It's a common confusing piece of the program. So you don't get extra money specifically for it, but if you have money left over after you've paid for the expensive meals and snacks, you can use it towards gardening, garden materials. And if you do use garden produce and CACFP meals and snacks, make sure to document the weight or volume of the produce you harvested and used in those snacks. And that is it. Sorry I kind of flew through that, but I realized we were crunched for time.
Thank you, Molly. That was a lot of information and really, really helpful. I think those are exactly the detailed questions that we get. So I want to remind all attendees that you can send in questions for Molly via the Q&A function. And Molly, we did have one question already. Someone was wondering, can you do informal procurement if there are not 3 vendors that meet your specifications?
Good question. So can you do informal procurement if you don't have 3 vendors that meet your specifications? Yes, there are plenty of rural areas in Minnesota where there's often only 1 or 2 vendors that even meet your needs and can follow CACFP rules. Like a lot of times vended meal providers, for example, it's hard to find someone to supply meals for your program that can follow all of the rules for CACFP. So yes, you can do that. We encourage you to try and find all and any, if that's the case, that you can compare.
When you document that, then do you just document, you know, this vendor can meet the specifications, no other vendors in my area can, and that's enough documentation for potential inspection?
Yeah, here, let me take my headpiece out because I have a colleague here who can.
Oh, great.
Okay, so can you repeat that real quick?
Yeah, so if you were trying to document the situation where there weren't 3 vendors who can meet your specs, can you just document, you know, I looked around and there weren't enough people that met the specs, so we're going with this person because they're the only one that can meet our specification?
Yeah, so what USDA would say is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. USDA would say maybe your specs are a little too tight. So it really depends. Like if it's reasonable to have specs that specific, then yes. And I know reasonable is a subjective term. But yeah, if your specs are such that you're eliminating all competition and there really are vendors out there who could probably give you something similar to what you are clearly targeting, then that wouldn't be okay. Does that make sense?
No, totally. So you can't artificially create specs that would only work for one vendor that you want to work with. You have to have normal specs that could potentially be met, but if they're not met by enough vendors, that's okay, if they're reasonable.
Yes.
I think that makes sense.
Is the key. And
Right.
that gets into like avoiding conflict of interest. So just because your brother sells beets, you can't design specs that only meet your brother's farm because you want to buy from your brother.
Right, right. That totally makes sense. Great. What kind of questions do you get on farm to early care or local purchasing while you're on your job?
It's a great question. Honestly, I think probably finding local farmers is a huge thing in the first place. So this procurement stuff can somewhat be an afterthought to that. But it sounds like you might be covering that in a future webinar.
Yes, that's a lovely segue. Thank you, Molly. I see that we are running up against our time here too. So I will say thank you everyone for participating today in our webinar. And if you are interested, I think that local procurement, local purchasing, and how you find your farmers is a huge topic. And we realized that it was such a big topic that we needed to make it its own webinar. So we will be covering that. And the different methods that you can use to purchase local products. That will be on July 18th. So that is our fourth webinar, and we actually have another one on June 27th. And that one is geared towards teaching staff and doing activities in the classroom to promote your farm to early care program. So please do join us for those. I will say we will have this webinar recorded and available on our website. We'll send out the link to attendees as well as links to the other amazing resources that have been mentioned by our presenters today, and their contact information if you do have further questions to follow up with them. We'll send out a follow-up email to all of the registrants. And again, as Katie mentioned, if you need proof of attendance, you can email Katie at her email address, which is up there. And otherwise, we hope that you can join us for future webinars. And thank you so much, Molly, for joining us today. That was very helpful information. And I know it's something we get asked about all the time. So this was great to have you here today. And thanks to Annalisa, too, who has already left. But all right. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.